Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about a few of the concepts and processes that we use to install RackForms on a Windows machine. Now, what's key to this is that Windows can certainly run an Apache stack where we're using Apache as our web server, but it's oftentimes easier just to use its native web server, which is Internet Information Services, or IIS for short. And that's what we're actually going to be taking a look at in this video. That's not to say that one is preferred over the other. It's just that in recent years, the process of using IIS and PHP together has gotten much easier and cleaner. And so it is now the recommended method here at RackForms to simply use IIS if we're on a Windows machine. And that's what we're going to cover in this video. So to get started then, essentially, there's a few moving parts here that we need to take a look at when it comes to installing RackForms and essentially getting an IIS machine set up for us. The first of which is to talk about the very important concept that RackForms is licensed software. And the license is a tie to a specific domain name. And this domain name is usually going to be the name that your personal website runs under. So you could be yahoo.com, for example, and you would license RackForms to yahoo.com. However, that's not to say that we can't run RackForms on a local machine. And the way that we do so is to use what we call a virtual host setup. So that's what we're going to also do in this video, is set up a virtual host. So let's get started with that. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and go into the Windows Explorer, and we want to go into our C drive, and we want to go to the Windows folder, System32. Notice I kind of typed there so that I skipped down to the S's. Then I'm going to go into drivers right here, and then finally the etc folder. Now the etc folder has a couple different files in it by default. I'm on Windows 8.1 here, though this will be the same if you're on Windows XP, Windows 7, and probably Windows 10 as well. And this host file is the one that we want to edit here. But before I edit it, I basically am going to drag off this little icon right here and drag it onto my desktop. You'll notice this creates a link on my desktop to this folder. I'm then going to take the host file and I'm going to drag a copy of it off onto my desktop as well. And you can see that I've already done that right here. Now the reason why we're going to do that is because this file right here is a protected system file, and it's not going to be possible to edit this file in place. We essentially need to create a copy of it somewhere else, like on our desktop, and then drag it into our System32 drivers, etc. folder. And so my preferred technique for that is to simply drag it off onto my desktop, make the changes that I need right here, and then drag it off into this little shortcut right here. That way I don't need to have this folder open the entire time, or if I need to go back to it, I can simply double click and go back to this path right here. Now, as far as running RackForms then, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this file here, this hosts file, in a text editor. Now, I prefer Notepad++. I suggest if you don't use it that you get it. It's a fantastic editor, though text programs of other sorts, including the ones that are built into Windows, would work just fine as well. But in this case, I'm going to use Notepad++. So Notepad++ is going to open this file. You'll notice here that by default, it's going to look like this, right? So if you haven't done any testing or any changes to this file on a Windows 8.1 machine, it'll look like this. Windows 7 will probably look a little bit different. In other words, we really don't have any entries on here. And actually, I should say these right here are probably something that parallels my virtualization software has done. So in other words, yours will probably actually look something like this. Essentially, what we're going to do here is we want to add entries for every website that we want to serve on our machine. In this case, I have two websites that I'm hosting on my local machine, Dev and a website called Paul. So Dev right here means that if I type Dev into a web browser, the Windows machine that I'm on is actually going to see that instead of going out to the internet to look for Dev, we're actually just going to stay on our local machine. And we're further going to loop back to this address 127.0.0.1. This is known as the loopback address or the localhost address. In other words, this means go to my local machine. So in other words, if I type in dev right here, I'm going to go to, because I've already set this up, my local installation of RackForms. Further, if I type in Paul right here, I will also go to a local web server that's been set up here for me. Now to really drive this point home, and by the way, we actually have another page that actually deals with this. Let me go ahead and bring this up for you. Right here. So if you're ever unsure about this, you go to RackForms.com, documentation, installation, and then virtual host setup. We actually cover all of these steps in this file right here, and including a video right here where we cover this as well. But basically what we're doing is we're saying whenever I type in Paul or Dev, we're going to go to my local machine. And again, to really drive this point home, let's say I go to yahoo.com right now. Right now, yahoo.com lives on the internet. So when I type in this address, it goes out to yahoo.com to grab that site. However, there's literally nothing stopping me from typing in my local loopback address and saying yahoo.com right here, saving this file. We'll close it here, close our web browser, and then take a copy of this file and replace the current one. Let me make sure I drag a copy back on my desktop. And now if I go to the internet again and I type in yahoo.com, I'm actually going to go to my local machine. So here I'm running IIS, so I go to Internet Information Services. So this host file is essentially saying, don't go to the internet, stay on my local machine. And then because the local machine has a web server running on it, which we'll take a look at shortly, it is now going to be serving these sites from here. Again, if I wanted to remove this, let's go ahead and open Notepad once more. I'll remove this yahoo.com entry, and I'll just leave Dev and Paul. These two values are going to be important in just a second, Dev and Paul. So let me go ahead and save this. I'll close Notepad again, and once again, I'll drag a copy back into my host folder here, and now we've updated this. Now you'll notice if I go back to yahoo.com, it's going to go back out to the internet to get that site. Sometimes there's a bit of a caching delay. Had to F5 there to make that change take hold. Okay, so that's the first step. We have two hosts on our machine. One is Dev and one is Paul. Now, because RackForms must be licensed to a particular domain, the point here is even if we're going to host RackForms locally, we need to come up with some kind of name to use to host it on. Here, Dev is what I usually use, though you could use basically any value that you wanted to. So Tester01, Dev01, etc. So knowing that I have two hosts called Dev and Paul, if I go into Internet Information Services, you'll see that I have two websites that host the Dev and Paul sites. However, before I actually get to that, we usually need to set up IIS on our target machine. And this is how we do that. We go down to the Start menu. We're going to go into Programs and Features. And again, this is Windows 8.1. On Windows 7, this is usually in Control Panel. So Start menu, Control Panels, Programs and Features. And basically, we're going to go into Programs and Features, and we're going to go to this Turn Windows Features On or Off box right here. When this window loads, it's going to bring up a list of all the extra components that we can install to a Windows machine. And again, this list is going to differ slightly depending on what version of Windows we're on and indeed what version of Windows we're using. But in most cases, we're going to have this guy right here, Internet Information Services. You notice it has a plus button next to it, and generally speaking, before I click the plus button, I'm simply going to check this box right here. Now you notice this box right now is a square, which means that not all options under here are actually checked. So for example, FTP server or an FTP server can be enabled under IIS, but it's not enabled by default. So instead of just a checkbox, which means that everything is enabled, it simply means not everything is enabled. Now what we do want to enable is this. I'm going to click the plus next to Internet Information Services. I'm going to click the plus next to Web Management Tools. And I want to make sure that IIS Management Console is checked. Nothing else under here needs to be checked. Then I'm going to go to Worldwide Web Services, and I'm going to get another set of submenus right here. Under Application Development Features, I want to make sure these guys are checked. ISAPI, CGI, ASP.NET 4.5, and then .NET Extensibility 3.5 and 4.5. Instead of trying to write these down, I would actually suggest that you either pause the video right here and do this yourself, or take a screenshot for further reference, because we're going to move on now. Under Common HTTP Features, most of these guys should be checked by default, but if not, make sure that static content, HTTP errors, directory browsing, and default document is also checked. Finally, under Health and Diagnostics, make sure HTTP logging is turned on. Make sure static content compression is turned on as well. And under Security, you may want to turn on request filtering, and if you're going to be doing work in ASP.NET, you may want to turn on things like Windows authentication and so on. But for our case right now, just having request filtering is enough. When all of these items are then checked, we're going to want to go ahead and click OK. Windows is then going to go ahead and download features from the internet and install everything that you need to have a full web browser on your machine. So what we want to do now is we want to essentially load up Internet Information Services. Now I've actually saved a shortcut on my desktop right here, but again, this is going to depend on where you are. Either going to start and go to all programs, or hit the Windows key and just start typing in Internet, and you should get Internet Information Services Manager. Right click on this and say pin to taskbar. Right now, again, I already have this done, so I have unpinned from taskbar, but you'll want to do pin to taskbar. That's not strictly necessary that you have to do this, but it's actually a really nice thing to be able to do to have this directly accessible to you. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to load IIS up. You're going to notice here that it is divided into three main panes. So here's my local machine. These are the sites that I'm running. Notice, again, I have two sites, Devin. Paul will look at this in just a second. I have a middle area here where all my features are, and then I have an actions panel right here where I can do various things that are based on what I've selected over here. Now before I do anything else, and as you may have already noticed if you're on Windows 7 or higher, you'll have already gotten a warning or a message that says, do you want to install the Web Platform Installer? And the answer is resounding, absolutely we do. Web Platform Installer is a new technology by Microsoft, well, it's about 2 or 3 years old now, that has dramatically simplified and awesomized, yes, I can use that word, the process of working with IIS and PHP. It used to be that working with PHP and IIS was a huge pain in the butt, but the Web Platform Installer has made it much, much simpler. Now, what's nice about that little warning that will come up, and again, if you're watching this in the future here, maybe it doesn't anymore, but usually you get a warning that says, do you want to install the Web Platform Installer? And again, you absolutely want to install it. If it doesn't come up, we can download it very easily from the internet. Simply type in Web Platform Installer, and one of the top hits should be the official Microsoft site. So go ahead and click on that and say free download, and then follow the install prompts. As soon as the Web Platform Installer is installed, it can actually be accessed by using your Start menu and just saying Web Platform Installer and running it this way, or we can access it under Management and Web Platform Installer right here. Either way, it gets us to the same place. Now, the reason why we've loaded Web Platform Installer up is even though we have a web browser, we actually don't have PHP installed. And so that's what we want to do. So basically, I'm going to, in the search box, type in PHP. I'll hit return, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and I want to select this single guy right here, PHP Manager for IIS. Now, again, I already have it installed, so you notice that it just says installed, but if you haven't already, there'll be a button that says add. You want to go ahead and click on add, and then click install. Now, what that's going to do is that's going to go through and it's going to set up IIS so that it serves PHP websites. Again, if you've done this in the past with IIS 6, you will be absolutely thrilled to know how easy it is now. It's a huge lifesaver. The other thing that Windows is actually going to need is MySQL or the SQL Server, right? So we need a database. And once again, Web Platform Installer makes this incredibly simple. We can install MySQL from Windows right here. Simply click Add, or we can install our SQL Server the exact same way. So you can do SQL Server Express with advanced services or any of the other SQL Server Express items. And so after you do that, that is install a database and install PHP, we're essentially ready to go as far as setting up our website. In other words, now I can go into IIS Manager right here and set up my site so that I serve my RackForms installation. So before I do that, there's a really important thing that happened when we installed IIS, and that is in my C drive, we created a folder called inetpub, and within inetpub, you'll have a further folder called wwroot. And this is usually where all the websites that we're hosting on our machine actually reside. So here you'll notice I have a folder called RackForms, and indeed, this is where my RackForms installation lives. You notice that all my files are in here, and indeed, that's where these guys are actually pointing to. But let's say I wanted to set up a new website for that Paul name that I had right there. So I'd do it something like this. I would go into wwroot, I'd right click, I'd say new folder, and I'd create usually a folder that's the same name as my site. You don't have to do that. I personally do that for convention because it keeps everything clean. So basically I have a folder called Paul. Now here's a real quick note before you do that. If you've never actually used your INET pub folder before, sometimes you'll get permission errors if you try to add files to this folder. Now, because I'm on a local machine and because I know nobody else will ever touch this machine, it's not actually serving a live website, what I actually do is this. I go to the INET pub folder, I'll right click on www.root, I'll go into properties, and I'll actually change under security here the owner of this folder so that's actually my local user. I'll simply apply full control options to my IIS users and my users right here. And again, I only do this because this is not a production web server. I'm only using this on my local installation. If, of course, you're doing this professionally, you'd want to be very careful about your app pool permissions and all that good stuff. But for now, it's a local machine, so I'm simply going to say my user has full permissions to this www.root folder. And so now we have a folder called Paul. And let's go ahead and create a new text file in here. And we'll call this index.html. And we'll just put some dummy text in here. So let's just say welcome. Go ahead and save this. Now we have an HTML page that's going to print out the word welcome to the screen. So how do we actually get IIS to serve this? Well, once again, going back to the very beginning of the video, you'll notice that in my host file right here, again, I have two addresses, two domain names that are pointing to my local machine, dev and Paul. So let's say I want Paul to point to this website right here. So here's how we do that. Let me go ahead and actually delete this guy here, just so we could start fresh. So you'll notice when I first launch IIS, we have this icon right here with an arrow. I'm going to click the arrow, and then further, you'll notice I have an arrow under sites. If I click that, you'll notice I have my default website, and I have dev. To add a new website, I'll go to sites, I'll just kind of hover my mouse over it, and I'll right click and say add website. A little add website wizard appears, and I now have a few fields that I want to fill in. So the first thing I'm asked for is my site name. Again, usually I'll keep this the same as my folder name, so I'll say Paul. The physical path is where the site actually resides, and we know it's in C, INET pub, www.root, Paul, so I'll select that folder. And then for host name, I'm simply going to say Paul. Again, the host name is what we define in the host file. I know that if I type in Paul into a web browser, it will get routed back to my local machine. And I further know that because I'm now setting up a host name of Paul in IIS, when IIS receives a request for Paul, it's actually going to route it to this physical path, to my Paul folder. So with that then, I'm done. You'll notice this little checkbox. By default is start website immediately. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. So now if I type in Paul, we'll go to my welcome page, and here we are. Of course, at this point now, it's simply a matter of knowing that I have a folder, in this case, this Paul folder, that is being looked at when I type in the Paul domain name. And now, if I was installing RackForms, I'd simply take my rackforms.zip folder, I would drag it into here. I should say I would unzip it into this folder so that it looks like this, that is the application files. And then I'd simply point my web browser to Paul, at which point the install.php file will automatically run, and we'd follow the on-screen prompts to set up our RackForms installation. I should point out now at this point that there are specific videos on the actual installation process. I'd point you to there now if you simply type in rackforms.com/documentation/installation. I'll go there right now. You'll notice that we have a lot of different videos on this exact process. So if I type in, for example, RackForms and RackForms Express, I have our quick install guide right here where I could watch this video and we'll set up RackForms. So in conclusion then, one of the really painful things about development a couple years ago was using PHP with a Microsoft stack. It was always a finicky process. Something always seemed to go wrong. With the web platform installer though, those days are completely erased, and thank goodness for it. It is super easy now to use Windows and the web platform installer to set up PHP so that RackForms runs on your local machine. Of course, if you ever have any questions about this process, please let us know at info@rackforms.com.